December twilight settled over the frontier town like a held breath. In his workshop at the edge of the settlement, Richard bent over a magnificent rocking horse, his chisel catching lamplight as it carved gentle curves into pine. The piece was destined for the banker's mansion, payment already secured. Outside, 3 small faces pressed against the frosted window. Thomas, 8 years old with his father's steady eyes, stood tallest. Mary, 6, rose on her toes to see better. Little Ruth, barely 4, had her palms flat against the cold glass, leaving prints that would freeze there overnight. Their breath fogged the pain and rhythm with their father's careful work. Richard glanced up and saw them. His chisel faltered mid-stroke. For a moment, father and children held each other's gaze through the barrier of glass and lamplight. Then Richard looked away, returning to the horse with hands that suddenly felt heavier. The toy would bring $20. The banker's son would play with it for a week, maybe 2, before forgetting it existed. Richard's children would remember watching it being made for the rest of their lives. He added the final detail, a carved bridle with tiny brass studs, and set down his tools. The horse was perfect. It always was. Richard's hands knew beauty the way other men knew scripture. Every curve, every joint, every painted eye reflected hours of skill honed since boyhood. Outside, Mary traced the horse's shape on the window with one small finger, following its outline like a prayer she couldn't speak aloud. Richard stood slowly, his back protesting the day's labor. Through the window, he could see his children more clearly now. Thomas wore a coat 2 winters too small. Mary's dress had been let down so many times the hem showed different shades of fading. Ruth clutched a corn-husk doll someone had given her last Christmas, its face nearly worn smooth. He crossed to the door and stepped into the cold. His children straightened immediately, their faces hopeful. "Time to head home," Richard said quietly. They fell in beside him without complaint. They never complained. That was somehow worse than if they'd begged. The walk to their cabin took 10 minutes through snow that crunched beneath their feet. Richard carried his toolbox. Thomas carried Ruth when she tired. Mary walked between them, humming a tune Sarah used to sing before she died. Their cabin sat small and dark against the winter sky. Richard lit the lamp and started a fire while the children hung their coats on pegs, worn smooth by small hands. The space was spare but clean. A table, 4 chairs, 3 narrow beds, a stove. Everything necessary. Nothing extra. Thomas went to his corner and picked up a piece of scrap wood Richard had given him. He carved slowly, carefully, trying to match his father's skill. Mary told Ruth a story about a princess and a magical horse. Ruth listened with her corn-husk doll pressed to her chest. Richard prepared their supper, thin stew stretched with potatoes and wild onions. The children ate without complaint, sharing the single biscuit he'd made, breaking it into 3 equal pieces without being asked. Later, after the children slept, Richard sat by the dying fire and stared at his hands. These hands built joy for strangers' children. Beautiful, perfect joy that his own would never hold. He thought of Sarah, how she'd made Christmas magical with almost nothing. Pine cones painted gold, paper chains, stories that felt like presents. She'd had a gift for making poverty feel like adventure. Richard had only his hands, and they built for other people's families. He banked the fire and lay down without undressing. Through the thin walls, he could hear the wind. Tomorrow he'd start the toy soldiers for the territorial governor, 20 of them, due by Christmas. The work would consume him outside. The workshop stood dark, but somehow in the darkness, its window seemed more visible than when the lamp burned a frame of absence where light and warmth and beautiful things existed just beyond reach. Dorothy's arms ached from carrying the stack of wrapped garments. She'd spent 3 days hemming the banker's wife's new dresses and now delivered them through evenings. Gathering cold. The work had been meticulous, every stitch invisible, every seam perfect. That was how Dorothy survived, by making herself indispensable through excellence. She passed the general store, nodded to Mrs. Henderson loading packages into her carriage. The banker's wife acknowledged her with the barest incline of her head, the kind of recognition wealthy women gave seamstresses, present but dismissible. Dorothy continued down the darkening street, her breath clouding the air. Then she saw them. 3 children stood at Richard's workshop window, absolutely still in the falling snow. Dorothy had passed this way before, had noticed the Toymaker and his family. But tonight something shifted in her perception, like adjusting a lens to sudden clarity. The children weren't just looking. They were watching with the intensity of souls who'd learned that hope required stillness, that desire unexpressed hurt less than desire denied. Dorothy stopped mid-stride. Through the window, Richard worked in lamplight. She could see his concentration, the gentle precision of hands that knew their craft. He was building something beautiful. A train. It looked like cars and an engine, wheels that would actually turn. Then she saw him hand something to Thomas through a gap in the window frame. A scrap of wood. The boy took it reverently, examining it like treasure. The gesture broke something open in Dorothy's chest. She'd been a widow for 2 years. Her husband taken by fever the winter after they'd married. They'd had no children. She'd mourned alone in her small shop, stitching other people's lives together while her own remained unraveled. She understood loneliness. She recognized it in the set of Richard's shoulders, in the way his children stood separate from the warmth they witnessed. Snow began falling harder. Mary shivered but didn't move from the window. Ruth pressed closer to her sister for warmth. Dorothy's hands found the quilt in her delivery basket almost unconsciously. Her mother's quilt. The last physical memory of hands that had taught her to stitch, to create beauty from scraps, to make something from nothing. Her mother had told her once. Near the end, some things matter more than keeping. Dorothy stood in the snow, holding the quilt, watching 3 children watch their father build joy for strangers. The scene arranged itself in her mind with the clarity of decision forming before thought could complicate. She knew what she would do. The realization came quietly. Without drama, she would sell the quilt, buy toys, deliver them anonymously. Richard's pride would stay intact. His children would have Christmas. Her own loneliness would ease, just slightly. Through the act of seeing and responding to need, Dorothy walked away slowly, not toward her remaining deliveries, but toward home. Her shop sat above the seamstress workspace, a single room with a bed, a stove, and shelves of fabric organized by color. She climbed the stairs and spread the quilt on her work table. Lamplight caught the stitching intricate patterns her mother had taught her. Small crosses and hearts worked into every square. Hundreds of hours of love made visible through thread. Dorothy ran her fingers over the stitches one last time. Then she folded the quilt with ceremonial care, wrapped it in plain cloth, and set it aside for tomorrow. She'd visit the merchant first thing. Mr. Cooper paid fair prices and asked few questions. The money would be enough. It had to be. Through her window, she could see Richard's workshop lamp still burning. He'd be there late. She knew. The Toymaker worked longer hours than anyone in town, his dedication visible in every perfect creation. But who saw him? Who noticed the man behind the toys? Dorothy pulled her own curtains closed and sat in darkness. Her mother's voice returned, gentle and certain. Some things matter more than keeping. Dorothy, some gifts only become real when you give them away. The quilt lay on the table, still and patient. Tomorrow it would become something else. Tomorrow it would become Christmas for 3 children who deserved to know that someone, somewhere, had noticed them. Richard woke before dawn to make breakfast. Oats boiled thin, divided into 4 bowls. A heel of bread split 3 ways for the children. Coffee for himself, bitter and dark. Thomas dressed silently and began his morning chores, splitting kindling, filling the water bucket from the well. Mary helped Ruth with her shoes. The cabin moved with practiced quiet, everyone knowing their part in the day's careful choreography. "Papa," Thomas said as Richard pulled on his coat, "will there be Christmas this year?" The question hung in the cold air. Mary stopped mid-motion. Ruth looked up from her corn-husk doll. Richard knelt to Thomas's level. "I'm working on something," he said, hating the evasion even as he spoke it. "The governor's commission pays well." "But you'll be working Christmas Eve," Thomas said, not accusatory. Simply factual, Richard's throat tightened. "I know." Thomas nodded, accepting what he shouldn't have to understand. "It's all right, Papa. We know you love us." The words gutted Richard more efficiently than any blade could. His 8-year-old son comforting him, releasing him from guilt, shouldering adult understanding with child-sized bones. "Work matters more than presents," Thomas added quietly. Richard pulled his son into an embrace, then Mary, then Ruth. He held them together in the cold cabin and felt the weight of every choice that had led them here. Sarah would have known what to say. Sarah had always found the words that transformed hardship into adventure. Richard had only his silence and his work. He released them and stood. "Be good for Mrs. Patterson today." The neighbor woman watched them when he worked late. "I'll be home when I can." The children nodded. Richard left before his resolve could weaken. At the workshop, he unpacked the governor's order. 20 toy soldiers, each requiring carved uniforms, painted faces, individual weaponry. The detail would consume him for 2 weeks. Christmas was 13 days away. Richard worked through morning into afternoon, his hands moving with unconscious skill. The soldiers began taking shape officers and infantry, cavalry and artillery, each one perfect. Each one destined for children who'd receive a dozen such gifts without remembering any particular one. He thought of Sarah. 4 years since she'd died bringing Ruth into the world. 4 years of managing alone, of being both father and mother, of trying to fill a space meant for 2 people. He'd poured his grief into work, become the best toy maker in the territory. But excellence didn't pay enough. Not for 3 children, not for Christmas. Richard set down his tools and stared at his hands. These hands had held Sarah when she was dying, had carved her headstone, had built a cradle for Ruth that she'd sleep in without ever knowing her mother had chosen her name. These hands built beauty and couldn't provide. Across town, Dorothy stood in Mr. Cooper's shop with her mother's quilt spread on the counter. The merchant examined it carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the stitching. "This is fine work," he said. "Your mother's—" "Yes. It's worth more than money, you know." Dorothy met his eyes. "That's why I'm selling it." Mr. Cooper studied her for a long moment, then nodded. He counted out bills more than Dorothy expected, less than the quilt deserved. "I'll find it a good home," he promised. "Thank you." Dorothy folded the money carefully and left. The quilt remained on the counter, no longer hers. She felt its absence like a missing tooth-tender space where something solid used to be, but in her pocket. She carried possibility. She walked to the general store. The owner, Mr. Webb, greeted her warmly. Dorothy was a good customer, always paying on time. "I need toys," she said quietly. "A wooden train set, a china doll, a stuffed lamb." Mr. Webb raised his eyebrows but didn't question. "I can have them by week's end." "I'll need them wrapped beautifully." "Of course." Dorothy counted out half the money as deposit. As she left, she saw Mrs. Henderson watching from the fabric section, eyes sharp with curiosity. Let her watch. Some acts were worth the scrutiny. Dorothy returned to her shop and began planning. Christmas Eve, she'd deliver the packages after dark. Anonymous, clean. Richard would never know who gave them, and his pride would survive intact. His children would wake Christmas morning to gifts that proved someone had seen them, even if they never knew who. She laid out her finest wrapping cloth and began cutting. Her hands found their rhythm measure. Cut, fold. And as she worked, she added her signature without thinking. Small crosses and hearts stitched into every wrapped edge. The pattern her mother had taught her. The pattern that marked everything Dorothy created. She didn't think about Richard recognizing it. She simply couldn't help making things beautiful, even in anonymity. Outside, snow began falling again. Christmas was 13 days away. Dorothy received the toys on Saturday afternoon. Mr. Webb had outdone himself. The train set was magnificent, with cars that connected and wheels that rolled smooth. The China doll had painted blue eyes and real hair. The stuffed lamb felt soft enough to comfort even the loneliest child. She wrapped each gift in her shop that evening, working by lamplight. Her hands moved with practiced precision, creating packages that looked like they'd come from somewhere far away, somewhere magical. She used her best cloth, added ribbon she'd been saving, made everything beautiful. And into each wrapping, she stitched her pattern, small crosses and hearts along the edges. She couldn't help herself. It was how her mother had taught her beauty mattered even in unseen places. Especially in unseen places. Sunday. Dorothy attended church and watched Richard and his children from across the aisle. They sat together in their worn clothes. The children perfectly behaved. Thomas helped Ruth with the hymnal. Mary sat very straight, trying to look grown up. Richard stared at the pulpit with hollow eyes. After the service, Mrs. Henderson approached Dorothy outside. "You seem quite interested in the Toymaker's family," she said, voice carrying the particular sharpness of a woman who noticed everything. "They're part of our congregation." Dorothy replied evenly, "Of course." Mrs. Henderson smiled without warmth. "Though some situations require more than Christian charity. Some require practical solutions." Dorothy waited. "Richard needs a wife of means." Mrs. Henderson continued, "Someone who could help provide for those children properly. Not—" She paused delicately. "Another person in need of providing for—" The comment landed with surgical precision. Dorothy felt heat rise in her cheeks but kept her voice steady. "I'm sure God has plans we can't always see." Mrs. Henderson. "Indeed. Though we must be careful not to confuse God's plans with our own wishes." Mrs. Henderson moved away, leaving Dorothy standing in the cold. The words stung because they touched truth. Dorothy was a seamstress, barely making enough for herself. What could she offer Richard's family except more mouths to feed? But the packages were already wrapped. The decision already made. Monday brought news that complicated everything. Dorothy heard it from Mr. Webb when she stopped by the store Richard's largest commission. A custom dollhouse for the governor's granddaughter had been damaged during delivery. The governor was demanding a replacement by Christmas morning or he'd refuse payment. "Richard's working night and day," Mr. Webb said, shaking his head. "That's $300 he can't afford to lose. He'll have to rebuild the whole thing in less than 2 weeks." Dorothy's stomach dropped. "Will he be home Christmas Eve?" "Doubt it. He'll be at the governor's mansion finishing the work. Those children will probably wake up alone Christmas morning." Dorothy walked home slowly. Her plan had depended on Richard being present, on the family waking together to find the gifts. If he was gone, if the children woke to an empty cabin and mysterious packages, she sat in her shop and stared at the wrapped toys. Everything suddenly felt presumptuous. Who was she to insert herself into their lives? What if the children were frightened by anonymous gifts? What if Richard was offended by charity he hadn't requested? Mrs. Henderson's words returned, "Another person. In need of providing for—" Dorothy pulled her shawl tighter. Outside. The December wind rattled her windows. Christmas was 10 days away. Richard would be drowning in work, absent from his children at the very moment they needed him most. And she'd prepared gifts they might wake to alone, confused and possibly afraid. She'd thought she was helping. Now she wondered if she was only making things worse. That night, Dorothy barely slept. She kept seeing the children's faces pressed against the workshop window, kept remembering Thomas's too adult understanding, Mary's careful dignity, Ruth's corn-husk doll worn smooth by small hands seeking comfort. By dawn, she still didn't know what to do. The packages sat in her back room, wrapped and waiting, beautiful and possibly useless. She dressed and went to her work table. Orders needed finishing a dress for the judge's wife, mending for the school teacher. Work continued regardless of personal turmoil, but her hands found their rhythm reluctantly. And every few minutes, she glanced toward the back room where the wrapped toys waited like questions she couldn't answer. Tuesday afternoon, Dorothy delivered mending to Richard's cabin. He was at the workshop, as always. She knocked softly and heard quick footsteps. Mary answered the door. Her face brightened when she saw Dorothy. "Miss Dorothy, Papa's not here." "I know, sweetheart. I have some clothes I mended for your father. May I bring them in?" Mary stepped aside. Of course. Dorothy entered the cabin and saw it fully for the first time. The space was small but meticulously clean. 3 narrow beds lined one wall, each covered with quilts so carefully patched they looked almost deliberate. A table held a wooden bowl with 3 apples, probably all the fruit they had. In the corner, Thomas carved at a piece of wood while Ruth napped on his bed. "Thomas made that," Mary said, pointing to a small horse on the table. "He's getting better." The carving was crude but showed promise. Dorothy picked it up carefully. "It's lovely. Papa says Thomas has good hands." Mary spoke with obvious pride. "Like him." Dorothy set down the mended clothes and found herself unable to leave. Something about the cabin held her its dignity despite poverty. The children's care for each other, the sense of a family holding together through sheer will. "Miss Dorothy." Mary's voice was quiet. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." The girl came closer, lowering her voice so Thomas wouldn't hear. "Papa needs someone to notice him too, not just us." Dorothy's breath caught. "What do you mean? Everyone sees him making toys. Nobody sees him being lonely." Mary's eyes were far too knowing for 6 years old. "He thinks we don't notice, but we do." Thomas glanced over, frowning slightly. Mary fell silent. Dorothy knelt to Mary's level. "Your father is a good man. The best." Mary's certainty was absolute. That's why someone should see him. Really see him. Like, she paused, searching for words. Like the way you look at our family when you walk past Papa's workshop. Heat flooded Dorothy's face. Had she been that obvious? "I should go," she said quietly. But Mary caught her hand. "Papa needs someone. We need someone. But Papa's too scared to ask." Dorothy squeezed the small hand gently, then released it. "Take care of your brother and sister. Mary." She left quickly, her heart pounding. Walking home through cold afternoon air, she kept hearing Mary's voice. Nobody sees him being lonely. The observation cut because it was true. Richard existed in town as the toymaker skilled, reliable, useful. But as a man, as a father struggling alone, as someone who might need help, might welcome companionship, he was invisible. And Dorothy had noticed him, had seen past the workshop window to the man inside, had recognized in him the same loneliness she carried. That evening, Mrs. Henderson stopped by Dorothy's shop with a dress for hemming. She lingered after handing over the garment. "I heard you visited Richard's cabin today," she said pleasantly. Small towns kept no secrets. "I returned some mending." "Of course." Mrs. Henderson examined a bolt of fabric with studied casualness. "You're aware, I'm sure, that Richard is quite overwhelmed this season. The governor's commission has him working day and night." "So I've heard. It would be unfortunate if he faced additional complications. Misunderstandings about intentions, for instance." Dorothy met her eyes directly. "I'm not sure I follow. Only that some women might mistake Christian kindness for something more. Might imagine possibilities where only charity exists." Mrs. Henderson's smile was sharp. "Richard needs practical help, not romantic notions from women who can barely support themselves." The words landed like stones. Dorothy kept her face calm. "Thank you for your concern. Mrs. Henderson, I'll have your dress ready by Friday." After the banker's wife left, Dorothy sat in the growing darkness. The criticism stung because it echoed her own fears. What was she to Richard? A seamstress who'd noticed his family's poverty. A woman projecting her loneliness onto his situation. The wrapped packages in the back room suddenly felt presumptuous, invasive, even. But then Mary's words returned, "Nobody sees him being lonely." Dorothy lit her lamp and pulled the packages out. She examined each one train set for Thomas. Doll for Mary, lamb for Ruth. They weren't invasive. They were witness. Proof that someone had looked past the workshop window and seen the whole family. Seen their worth. Whether Richard ever knew who gave them didn't matter. What mattered was that his children woke Christmas morning knowing someone cared. Dorothy rewrapped one package where the ribbon had loosened. Her stitching caught lamplight small crosses and hearts marking every edge. She was signing her mercy without meaning to. But perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps love couldn't help leaving fingerprints. Wednesday morning brought disaster. Dorothy heard about it from Mr. Webb when she stopped at the store for thread. Richard's dollhouse, the elaborate replacement for the governor's damaged commission, had been nearly complete. When a supporting beam cracked during transport to the mansion for final assembly, the entire structure needed reinforcing, plus additional decorative work to cover the repair. "The governor's furious," Mr. Webb said grimly. "Told Richard if it's not perfect by Christmas morning, he won't pay. That's $300 Richard desperately needs." "When is Christmas morning delivery?" "Dawn, which means Richard has to work through Christmas Eve night at the mansion. He won't be home when his children wake up." Dorothy's carefully laid plans crumbled. She'd intended to leave the packages Christmas Eve evening, assuming Richard would be home to find them with his children. But if he was at the mansion all night, those poor children, Mrs. Patterson said, joining the conversation. She was the neighbor who watched Richard's family. "I'll stay with them Christmas Eve, but waking up without their father." On Christmas of all days, her voice trailed off, the tragedy self-evident. Dorothy left the store with her thread and walked home through cold that seemed to seep into her bones. Everything felt wrong suddenly. Her anonymous gift, meant to bring joy, might instead confuse or frighten children waking alone. Richard might interpret it as charity, an insult to his pride. Mrs. Henderson's warnings echoed presumptuous, inappropriate, another mouth to feed. At her shop, Dorothy pulled out the packages and sat staring at them. The train set seemed too elaborate now. The doll too expensive. The lamb suite for Ruth, perhaps. But would a 4-year-old understand why strangers left gifts? She thought about returning everything to Mr. Webb, reclaiming what money she could. Her mother's quilt was already gone. But at least she'd avoid making a mistake that might hurt rather than help. Thursday afternoon, Richard stopped by Dorothy's shop. She looked up from her sewing in surprise. He stood in the doorway, hat in hands, looking exhausted. "Miss Dorothy," he said formally, "I'm told you returned some mending to my cabin earlier this week. I wanted to thank you." "It was nothing." "Mary mentioned you were kind." He paused, seeming to search for words. "She said you noticed things." Their eyes met. Dorothy saw the toll the commission was taking shadows under his eyes, tension in his shoulders, the weight of a man trying to hold too much alone. "Your children are wonderful," Dorothy said quietly. "They deserve better than I can give them." The admission hung between them, raw and honest. Dorothy wanted to say he was wrong, that his love was enough, that he was doing his best under impossible circumstances, but platitudes felt insulting. They deserved to know they're seen. She said instead, that someone notices how special they are. Richard nodded slowly. "I should go." "The governor's work?" "Of course." He turned to leave, then paused. "Miss Dorothy, Mary said you look at us like we matter. I wanted you to know." His voice roughened. "That means something, even if nothing comes of it. Just being seen means something." He left before she could respond. Dorothy sat motionless, Richard's words echoing. Being seen means something. That evening, Mrs. Henderson visited again, this time with criticism barely veiled as concern. "I heard Richard stopped by your shop. People are beginning to talk. Dorothy." A single woman receiving visits from a widower, it creates impressions. He was thanking me for returning mending. Nevertheless, Mrs. Henderson's tone sharpened. "You should know that some of us believe Richard needs a wife of means. Someone who could truly help those children. Not simply," she paused delicately, "add to his burdens." Dorothy stood. "Was there anything else, Mrs. Henderson?" The banker's wife held her gaze. "Only that you should know your place. Some women ought to understand the difference between kindness and presumption." After she left, Dorothy sat in darkness. The packages mocked her from the back room. Who was she to think she could help a seamstress barely making enough to survive? Imagining she could ease a family's poverty with toys purchased by selling her last valuable possession, Mrs. Henderson was right. She was presuming, overstepping, inserting herself where she had no right to be. The wrapped packages suddenly looked like evidence of foolishness. Beautiful. Expensive foolishness that would solve nothing and might offend everything. Dorothy pulled her shawl tight and stared at the lamp flame. Christmas was 6 days away. Richard would be at the governor's mansion Christmas Eve. His children would wake alone to mysterious packages from a stranger, and she would have traded her mother's quilt for a gesture that might hurt more than it helped. Christmas Eve afternoon arrived gray and cold. Dorothy stood in her shop, the 3 packages arranged on her work table. For 5 days she'd been paralyzed by doubt, unable to deliver them, unable to return them. Now time had run out. Richard was already at the governor's mansion. Mrs. Patterson had collected the children that morning. They'd spend Christmas Eve with her, wake Christmas morning in a stranger's house while their father worked through the night to save a commission he couldn't afford to lose. Dorothy touched the train set's wrapping. Her stitching caught the gray light, small crosses and hearts worked into every edge. Her mother's pattern. Her signature on mercy she wasn't sure she should give. She thought of Mrs. Henderson's warnings, of her own poverty, of Richard's pride, of 3 children who might wait confused and frightened by anonymous gifts. Every rational thought said, "Don't do this." But then Mary's voice returned. "Nobody sees him being lonely. Nobody sees us." Dorothy closed her eyes. Her mother's words followed, "Some things matter more than keeping." She'd already sold the quilt. The money was spent, the gifts were purchased and wrapped. The only question remaining was whether she had the courage to follow through on faith without guarantee. To give, without knowing the outcome. Dorothy pulled on her coat as twilight gathered. She wrapped the packages in oilcloth to protect them from snow, then carried them through darkening streets. Her arms ached with their weight. Her heart pounded with fear and determination in equal measure. Mrs. Patterson's house sat quiet. Lamplight glowed in the windows. Dorothy could see shadows moving inside the children. Probably preparing for bed. She knelt on Mrs. Patterson's doorstep and arranged the packages carefully. Train set for Thomas. Doll for Mary. Lamb for Ruth. Each wrapped in beautiful cloth. Each marked with stitching that said someone noticed. Someone cared. Someone believes you matter. Dorothy stood and knocked once. Firmly. Then she turned and walked quickly away, not looking back. Behind her. She heard the door open. Heard Mrs. Patterson's surprised voice. Heard the children's excited questions. Dorothy kept walking through falling snow, her tracks disappearing behind her. At the governor's mansion, Richard worked in a guest workshop set up for the commission. The dollhouse was nearly complete, 3 stories, 12 rooms, intricate furniture in every space. His hands moved mechanically, exhaustion making him clumsy. He thought about his children waking without him, thought about another Christmas of absence and poverty, thought about Sarah and how she'd made magic from nothing. He thought about Dorothy's words. They deserve to know they're seen. His chisel slipped, gouging a decorative panel. Richard cursed softly and began the repair. The work stretched ahead of him 6 more hours minimum, maybe 8. The governor wanted the dollhouse delivered at dawn. Richard would finish. He always finished. His hands would create perfection for a child who'd barely notice. And his own children would wake to what Mrs. Patterson's kindness, another year of patient poverty, chisel blurred in his vision. Richard set it down and pressed his palms against his eyes. 4 years of this. 4 years of trying to be enough for 3 children while knowing he'd never manage it alone. He picked up the chisel and continued working. Dawn broke cold and clear. Richard delivered the dollhouse to the governor's granddaughter personally. She squealed with delight. The governor paid $300 without comment. Richard pocketed the money and walked home through fresh snow, so tired he could barely see straight. His cabin came into view, and on the doorstep, clearly visible even from a distance, sat 3 wrapped packages. Richard stopped walking. For a long moment he simply stared. Then he approached slowly, his hands beginning to shake. The packages were beautifully wrapped in cloth he didn't recognize. Ribbon he'd never seen. But along every edge, worked into the fabric with meticulous care, ran a familiar pattern, small crosses and hearts. Richard lifted one package. His fingers traced the stitching precise, delicate, unmistakable. He'd seen this exact pattern before, on mended clothes Dorothy had delivered, on church banners she'd made, on her own Sunday dress. Understanding hit him like physical force. Dorothy, the quiet seamstress who walked past his workshop, who'd noticed his children, who'd seen what no one else bothered to see. She'd done this. Richard sank to his knees on the snowy doorstep, holding the packages, and felt 4 years of isolation crack open. Someone had seen them, not just noticed, truly seen. Seen his children's worth, his struggle, the whole family's quiet dignity in the face of hardship. Dorothy had witnessed them, and she'd responded with costly mercy. Richard looked at the stitching through tears he didn't try to stop. The packages weren't anonymous at all. Dorothy had signed her name in thread, unable to give without leaving her heart's fingerprints. She'd protected his pride while honoring his children. She'd given without demanding recognition. She'd seen them when the rest of the town looked away. The sun cleared the horizon, painting snow gold. Richard stood slowly, cradling the packages. Inside, he could hear his children stirring. Mrs. Patterson had brought them home at first light. He had $300 in his pocket and 3 gifts in his arms. And he finally knew what he needed to do. Richard opened the door quietly. Thomas, Mary, and Ruth sat at the table in their nightclothes while Mrs. Patterson made breakfast. All 4 looked up as he entered. Papa! Ruth scrambled from her chair and ran to him. Richard caught her one-armed, still holding the packages. What are those? Mary asked, eyes wide. Richard set the packages on the table. I found them on our doorstep. The children gathered around. Thomas reached out carefully, touching the wrapped train set. Mary stared at the package clearly meant for her. Ruth pointed to the smallest one. Open them, Richard said softly. Thomas unwrapped first. The train set emerged beautiful carved wood, wheels that rolled, cars that connected. His face transformed, joy replacing the careful control he usually maintained. Mary unwrapped her doll with trembling hands. When she saw its painted face, its real hair, she pressed it to her chest and cried. Ruth needed help with her lamb. When Richard freed it from the wrapping, she grabbed it and buried her face in its softness, making small sounds of wonder. Mrs. Patterson wiped her eyes. Who? Someone who noticed, Richard said. He picked up a piece of the wrapping cloth, showed her the stitching. Someone who couldn't help leaving her signature. The children played with their gifts while Richard made a decision. Get dressed, he told them. Your Sunday clothes, we're going out. 20 minutes later, Richard walked through town with 3 children in tow. Thomas carried his train carefully. Mary held her doll like precious cargo. Ruth wouldn't release her lamb. They reached Dorothy's shop as morning light strengthened. Richard knocked. Dorothy opened the door and froze. Her eyes went immediately to the children's gifts, to Richard's face, to the piece of wrapping cloth he held. Why? Richard asked. His voice broke on the single word. Dorothy looked at the children first. She knelt to their level. Because your father makes joy for everyone else. You deserved your own. Then she stood, meeting Richard's eyes. Because your children deserve Christmas too. Richard felt his defenses crumble completely. I can't repay this. I'm not asking you to. They stared at each other while snow began falling again. 4 years of loneliness, 2 years of widowhood. All the careful distance they'd both maintained, it dissolved in the space between them. Richard stepped closer. I have nothing but 3 children who need a mother, hands that build toys, and a heart that just remembered how to feel. But if you'll have us, we're yours. Dorothy's eyes widened. Richard, marry me, he said simply. Not a question. A statement of necessary truth. Mary tugged Dorothy's skirt. Please say yes. Papa needs you. We need you. Thomas nodded seriously. Ruth held up her lamb as if offering evidence. Dorothy looked at each child, then at Richard. She saw what he was offering, not wealth or ease, but partnership, family. The chance to be seen and to see others, to build a life together from honest foundations? Yes, she said quietly. Always yes. Richard kissed her then, gentle, grateful, sealing covenant in front of witnesses who cheered. Through the shop window. Early risers passing on the street stopped to watch and smile. Mrs. Henderson, walking past with her husband, paused. For a moment her face showed surprise, calculation, then something that might have been resignation. She nodded once and continued walking. Dorothy laughed against Richard's shoulder. The whole town will talk. Let them, he murmured. We'll give them something worth talking about. The children pressed close, and Dorothy knelt to embrace them properly. Mary whispered, I knew you'd say yes. I knew you saw us. I did, Dorothy said. Tears on her cheeks. I do. Richard helped her to her feet. We should make this proper, today. If Pastor Williams will have us. Today night Dorothy's eyes widened. I've wasted 4 years already. I won't waste another day. So they walked together through morning snow to the church, a toymaker, a seamstress, and 3 children carrying gifts that proved mercy was real. Pastor Williams, surprised but delighted, agreed to perform the ceremony that afternoon, by sunset. Dorothy was Mrs. Richard Coleman. By nightfall, she was moving her belongings to the cabin. By the time the children slept, Thomas with his train, Mary with her doll, Ruth with her lamb. Dorothy sat beside Richard at the table in the home that was now hers too. You sold your mother's quilt, Richard said quietly, having heard the story from Mrs. Patterson. Yes. That was everything you had left of her. Dorothy met his eyes. I traded one kind of love for another, and found I got both back. Richard took her hand, their fingers intertwined, calluses matching calluses. 2 people who worked with their hands to create beauty, now building something together. Outside, snow continued falling. Inside, lamplight steady. A family formed not by blood but by choice, by witness, by the courage to see and be seen. 3 months later, early March brought the first real thaw. Dorothy stood in the workshop doorway watching Richard teach Thomas advanced joinery. The boy's hands moved with increasing confidence, his father's patience evident in every careful correction. Like this, Papa. Exactly like that? You're a natural son? The word son still made Dorothy smile. Richard had fully claimed all 3 children, not just as his by blood, but as theirs together. And the children had claimed Dorothy just as completely, calling her Mama Dorothy without hesitation, seeking her for comfort and celebration alike. Mary sat at Dorothy's work table, designing doll clothes from fabric scraps. She'd inherited her father's eye for beauty and her new mother's skill with needle and thread. The combination was producing remarkable results. Ruth napped in the corner, her lamb clutched tight, peaceful in the way only secure children could be. The workshop had expanded. Dorothy's sewing workspace now shared the building with Richard's toy making. They worked side by side most days, their rhythms complementing each other. Tourists passing through town often stopped to watch the seamstress and Toymaker, creating beautiful things together while their children played nearby. Business had improved too. Richard took fewer large commissions and more custom pieces, keeping prices fair but not cheap. Dorothy's clientele had expanded to include women from neighboring settlements who'd heard about her work. Together, they earned enough to live comfortably. More importantly, they had time. Richard kept Saturdays for family now. They'd picnic when weather allowed, take walks, visit neighbors. The children thrived under the attention. Thomas had grown 2 inches and started smiling more. Mary had stopped trying to be so grown up. Ruth chattered constantly, secure enough to demand rather than simply accept. That evening, the family gathered on their new porch. Richard had built a bench wide enough for all of them. They watched sunset paint the melting snow gold and pink. "Mr. Davis stopped by today," Richard said. "Asked if I'd teach his son woodworking." "What did you say?" "That I'd be happy to. Saturdays are for family, but Sunday afternoons work fine." Dorothy squeezed his hand. Watching Richard offer to teach others what he'd learned, that was the clearest sign of healing. He'd moved from isolation to generosity, from survival to sharing. A neighbor child walked past on the street, staring longingly at the workshop window. Richard noticed and called out, "You interested in learning to carve, son?" The boy's face lit up. "Really, Mr. Coleman. Stop by Sunday after church. Bring your father if he'd like. We'll see what your hands can do." The boy ran off, calling for his father. Dorothy felt pride swell in her chest. This was Richard fully restored, not just a man who'd survived loss, but one who'd learned to give again. That night, tucking Ruth into bed, Dorothy smoothed the child's hair. Ruth looked up sleepily. "Mama Dorothy, did you really buy us Christmas with your grandmama's quilt?" Dorothy considered the question carefully. "I traded one kind of love for another, and found I got both back." Ruth nodded, satisfied. "That's good trading. The very best kind." Dorothy kissed her forehead and stood. Richard waited in the doorway, watching. When she joined him, he pulled her close. "Thank you," he whispered. "For what?" "For seeing us. For having the courage to act. For—" His voice caught. "For everything." Dorothy tilted her face up. "Always." They stood together in the quiet cabin, listening to their children breathe in sleep. Outside, March wind carried the last of winter away. Inside, a family built by choice continued the steady work of loving each other through ordinary days. Through the workshop window, lamplight glowed warm. Once, that window had been a barrier, children watching beauty they couldn't have. A father too proud to ask for help. A community too busy to notice. Now it was an invitation. Light that welcomed. A place where skill met compassion. Where work and family intertwined. Where mercy had built itself a permanent home. Dorothy leaned against Richard's shoulder. "You know what your children taught me. What's that? That the best gifts arrive on doorsteps. But the best families arrive when someone finally has courage to knock." Richard kissed the top of her head. Outside, a neighbor walked past and waved through the window. They waved back. Some debts weren't paid with money, but with a lifetime. And sometimes, a lifetime was exactly what mercy offered: enough time to build a home where none existed before. Enough days to love without counting. Enough grace to transform watching through glass into standing together inside warmth. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. March's promise held. Winter had passed, and in its place, a family remained.